Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 22nd, 2018, and my guest is author A.J. Jacobs. His latest book is Thanks 1,000, A Gratitude Journey, and that is our subject for today's conversation. A.J., welcome to EconTalk.
Well, thank you. Of course, I have to say thank you. It's my job, but I do mean it. I'm a fan of the show, so delighted to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm delighted too, and I'm a big fan of gratitude, which we're going to spend some time talking about today. What's the idea behind the book?
Well, the idea is it came about because for a couple of years I had been saying these sort of secular prayers of Thanksgiving before meals. And they're not traditional prayers because I'm not very religious. So instead of thanking God, I would thank some of the people who helped bring my food to the plate. So I'd say thank you to the farmer who grew the tomatoes and the woman at the store who sold me the tomatoes. And it was going okay. My kids were tolerating it until one day my son, who was 10 at the time, said, "You know, Dad, what you're doing is kind of lame because they can't hear you. You know, these people are not in our apartment. If you really cared, you would go and thank them in person." And I thought, that is an interesting idea. It's a good book idea. Thank you for helping me with my career. And that set me off on a journey that took months, and it took me around the world. And I ended up thanking over 1,000 people who had even the smallest role in making my morning cup of coffee. And it was really revelatory because you realize there are hundreds of people we take for granted. And I love that you've talked about this on your show in various ways, that it doesn't take a village to make a cup of coffee. It takes the world.
A horde, an army. Yeah, it's one of the most, I think, beautiful things. There is something lovely about knowing everyone or being able to thank everyone easily who serves you in different ways. But in the modern world, of course, we're served by thousands of people we don't see. But you made an actual effort to thank them face to face, which is a very cool experience. So talk about the lengths you went in the book. You start with your barista on the corner and at Joe's, the coffee shop you like.
Right.
And talk about some of the range of ways that you went to be grateful to those folks.
Well, right. I started and I worked my way backwards. And I tried to thank people in person if possible, but also by phone and by email. And what you realize very quickly is it's 6 degrees of gratitude. It's just a never-ending chain, because I could thank the truck driver who drove the coffee beans to the store, but he couldn't have done his job without the road. So I would thank the people who paved the road, and they couldn't have done their job without the people who painted the yellow lines on the road so that the truck didn't crash into oncoming traffic. And it was just, I could have spent 100 years doing it. I could have gotten to over 1 million people thanking, and it was wonderful. And I would. It was a little awkward because you're saying it's not a normal thing we do in society, is thanking these people who are very vaguely connected to what you're doing, but. It was wonderful. I mean, you had a range of reactions. You had some people who were like, I'd call them up and they'd be, "Is this a pyramid scheme? What's going on? What are you trying to sell?" But by far the majority were delightfully and pleasantly surprised. So I remember I called the woman who does the pest control for the coffee beans at the warehouse where my coffee is stored, and I said, "I know this sounds strange, but I just want to thank you for keeping the bugs out of my coffee." And she said, "Well, that is strange, but I really appreciate it. I don't get a lot of gratitude And it was like an anti-crank phone call is the way I was sort of penance for the obnoxious prank phone calls I made in high school. And if it's done well, if it works, it's good for both the thanker and the thankee. You feel better and they feel better.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of gratitude, and we'll talk about the whole concept because it's woven into the book. I do want to mention, though, when I was interested in industrial processes, I called the people who made the Gamma Ray Detector that is used to make sure that cans of soda are filled to the top. So cans of soda are filled to the top, which is amazing. You almost never get a can that's not, and that's because every can has gamma rays shot through the top, and there's a detector and through the top part of the can, and if there's liquid there, fewer get through, and if it's empty, more get through, and then they know that the can's defect hasn't been filled correctly. And I had a very long and interesting conversation with that person, but as you experienced, a lot of these folks don't get a lot of contact from the public. Some of them are very happy and thrilled that someone's actually paying attention to their job. And others are like, what's wrong with you?
Well, I love that. I did not know about that gamma ray, but it's just one of thousands of examples. And I loved talking to the guy who designed the lid for my coffee cup, because the amount of passion and thought that went into he's an entrepreneur, and he's sort of like the Elon Musk of coffee lids. He's very, hopefully a little more emotionally stable, but he's very he's very innovative and passionate, and he designed it so that there's a hole in the middle to let out the aroma, because the aroma is such a big important part of coffee. So it was remarkable, and as you say, people don't often acknowledge that, and I think that's a shame.
Yeah, the other part of it, which I love, which I think is a big part of life satisfaction that's missed, is that not only did you have the satisfaction of thanking these folks and giving them, a pleasant moment, ideally a little more than a moment, but at least one pleasant moment, but it reminded them that what they do isn't just punching out lids or punching out steel or driving a truck, that they're actually improving people's lives. And in my experience, most of us tend to reduce our lives, or the work part of our lives, to a very narrow set of actions that we then say, I did those well, or I'm good at my job. But they don't. I think it's a tremendously lost thing that we don't think enough about how we affect other people. My sister's a real estate agent, and when I was thinking about this a few years ago, I asked her how often she stopped to think about what she did. Obviously, she works hard. She tries to make a lot of money. That's normal and human. But I said, how often do you stop to think about the fact that people who come to your town scared and uneasy, and you comfort them and find them something that's appropriate for them that makes their lives better? And she said, never. And thank you, because it actually it moved her. She's actually doing something that's more than just earning a commission.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Seeing it as part of a bigger picture. And it reminds me of the story of JFK, which I actually don't think is apocryphal. I looked into it. It looks real. But when he was touring NASA, he ran into a janitor, and he asked the janitor, "What is your job here?" And the janitor said, "I am helping man get to the moon." Like, he realized that, his keeping the NASA offices clean was a small part in their big mission. And that must have given him a lot of meaning, which is wonderful.
Yeah, actually, I just want to reference the book, My Grandfather's Blessings, by Rachel Naomi Remen, which is where I first saw this idea. And she tells the story of somebody who's terminally dying of cancer, and they gathered all the people in the room who was a doctor, and they gathered all the people in the room who had benefited from some procedure or some treatment that he had created. And, it was an incredibly powerful evening, but the tragedy of the evening, it was a beautiful thing, but something of a tragedy is he didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that. And he was more focused on developing the device or the treatment or whatever it was. And it's really important, I think, that we think about, what we do. You and I are doing this strange thing. You write a book You do get occasional emails from people who I'm sure thank you and who probably curse you out sometimes, but most of them are pleasant. But the 90%, 99%, 99.99% of the people who love your book will never tell you.
I know, and it is so motivating to try to remember. And actually, that's what inspired me. As part of the marketing of this book, I decided to do a project where I would write 1,000 thank you notes to anyone who had ever read a book or an article by me. And you can go on the internet and fill out a form and say, anything you want, and I'll respond with a personalized, handwritten paper note. And, it's been a pain in the butt, but at the same time, it's been wonderful. It's so lovely to get feedback and how the books have touched people. And, it's very inspiring because if you can remember that what you're doing is not just for yourself, that it's improving society, hopefully, and it's touching other people, hopefully, that to me is the most inspiring part of work.
You mentioned your parents, and that's an obvious example where, for me, and when I first was blessed with a child, one of the things that it does a lot of things too, but one of the things it does too is it makes you realize what your parents did for you. Because tragically or not, realistically, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. And when you have your own child, you realize, oh my gosh. and you should be overwhelmed by gratitude. And I think, how often you tell your parents how grateful you are for what they did for you, it is an open question, but telling them is a really good idea, I think.
I love that, and I hope my kids are listening to this podcast. But yeah, and it's not. That was just one way I could have gotten to 1,000 people. Is I could have thanked the parents of the barista, and then their parents, and it's a chain. So yeah, just another example of interconnectivity, which I think is a theme of your show. And by the way, I loved your poem about the loaf of bread, which has a similar sort of a similar vibe about all of the people involved in making one loaf of bread that we don't think about.
Yeah, I like to say self-sufficiency is the road to poverty. It's very hard to have a modern lifestyle with all of its superficiality, but all of its greatness and implications for our health and our enjoyment if we take advantage of it correctly. But it's very hard to have that lifestyle without relying on millions of people. And people don't really realize that. And there's no one to thank for that. That's something we know that I want to come back to. But let's talk about one of the things I really loved about the book is you thanked a lot of people who played a small role. And you talk about one of the people you encounter is a bass player in a band, which is not the most glamorous parts of a band. Talk about the role of the bass player.
Yeah, the bass player was actually, his real job was that he was the taster who chose the coffee beans that my coffee, and it was wonderful because the amount of passion again that went into this, and he would take a sip and be transported. And I sense notes of maple syrup and jasmine, and I would take a sip and be like, well, I'm sensing coffee. I taste some coffee, but the amount of thought that he put into it actually makes my life better. Whether or not I realize it, I'm tasting better coffee. But he, in his spare time, he's the bass player for a band. And he said the bass players just don't get the same recognition. Everyone wants to be the lead singer. But you can't have a good band without a bass player. And I loved that. And I ran across a term from psychology, the responsibility bias, and that we focus on the one person, and it's just an error. I say in my book, for instance, I am perpetuating that error by having my name on the cover as the only name. Sure. If this were a more honest book, it would say, by A.J. Jacobs, and then it would list 100, my editors, the people who designed it, the people who cut down the wood to make the pages. There are hundreds of people. And I actually brought it up. I was like, maybe this would be interesting. And the editor's like, that would just confuse the heck out of people. So we're not going to do that. But I loved his point of that we need more bass players. And I think in society, like even just in science, we need more. Not everyone should be trying to come up with a brilliant new hypothesis. We need people to replicate experiments. We need people. It's not as glamorous, but it's so important.
Yeah, I wrote an essay recently called "The Story of My Life," where I think many of us tend to see our own personal experiences as a movie where we're the star, and that sometimes it might be better, maybe most of the time, to think of ourselves as part of an ensemble that is creating something that's grander than just my lead story. I think about people who sing in the chorus of a musical. They get zero recognition often, very little, and yet they're totally devoted to it. And it's once you've been in that role and you realize how deeply satisfying it can be to merely, and I put that in quotes, be part of the ensemble, it changes the way you look at life. It changes the way you think about a lot of things that you do, from both parenting to the workplace.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, finding meaning and being part of a community, being part of something bigger. And it reminds me of, I saw Chris Rock's stand-up special a couple of months ago where it's called Tambourine. And it's because he's saying in marriage, sometimes you get to be the lead singer, but a lot of times you're playing the tambourine in the background, and you've got to enjoy that tambourine. Like, you can't be complaining and rolling your eyes about the tambourine. You better embrace the tambourine. And he actually says he did not embrace the tambourine, and that's why he's divorced.
Yeah, that's a beautiful. I would have said, need a T-shirt, more tambourine, but or less. I don't know. But it's funny that he used tambourine instead of cowbell. But I guess that was his own. Tambourine is that's a great example, right? It's just you're just adding something nuanced that most people won't notice, but if it weren't there, it wouldn't be as good. And that, I think, is the way to think about a lot of these interactions.
Absolutely.
I want you to talk about the role that your gratitude practice played in reducing annoyance. So I don't know how successful it ultimately was. It makes the book more interesting, certainly. But talk about how you hoped, at least, to have gratitude replace annoyance.
Yeah, I think my default mode, like many people's, is to be annoyed. Find the 3 or 4 things wrong every day and focus on them. I think of it almost like a battle between my inner Larry David and my inner Mr. Rogers. And I think my Larry David is very strong. So this was partly an attempt to strengthen my Mr. Rogers. And I do think it was successful. I mean, I still get annoyed a huge amount, but just doing a practice of focusing on the hundreds of things that go right in every part of our lives, it really is a radical shift in perspective. And trying to, when you get in an elevator and press the elevator button and the elevator goes up instead of plummeting to the basement, focus on that. I'm particularly, one of my most irrational biases is that I'm obsessed that there's a conspiracy that when I go to the airport, my gate is always 2.5 miles from the security. But it's not.
That happens to me too. Incredible.
I know. Well, you would think, but it's just because I remember those. I focus on those, and so I make nowadays I try to make a very clear point to myself. Almost say it out loud, like, "Look at this! I'm at gate number 1. Then I walked out of security, and here it is. So remember this next time you're complaining to yourself." And I find, as I say, my Larry David remains strong, but Mr. Rogers is coming back.
It's such a challenge. And at one point you used the phrase first world problems. Most, of course, those of us who live in the first world have first world problems. We don't have the worst problems that billions of people have around the world. We're very lucky to be in where we are. But I think what's fascinating to me psychologically is how hard it is to talk yourself into that perspective.
It is, because it's so, the annoying things are so present. And I think, if you believe in evolutionary psychology, you believe that we were built to notice these things, because it's more important you notice the lion that might attack you. But I would say it is key to just try to focus on all the things. It's almost a creative game, thinking of all of the things that go right. And even, there's the cliche, half glass full, half glass empty. I actually have tried to reframe that, and maybe that's not the right perspective. The right perspective is, can you believe that we can turn on a tap, turn on a lever, and have clean, drinkable water? And so it's not just that the glass is half full, it's that it's astounding we have any water in there at all. And millions of people, and throughout history, 99% of human history, we did not have this. So it's a challenge, because our default, I think, is not that. But it does make your life better if you really practice at it.
And give a very nice example about lying in bed before you fall asleep and going from A to Z. Describe that.
Right. This was a ritual a friend of mine told me about that I love, and it's that to go to sleep, instead of counting sheep, count things that you're grateful for. And I do it alphabetically. So you start with A, and it could be, the example I used in the book was very related to coffee. So A is for Arabica, which is the type of beans that taste really good. And B is for, I can't remember what B is for, but
beans.
Beans, there you go. Or the boat, the fact that we have shipping and we have containers. I mean, I learned all this about the astoundingness of pallets and containers. I never thought I would be so blown away.
That's incredible.
Yeah, by the change. So yeah, I do find that a good way. No sheep, don't do sheep. Try counting your blessings or what's going right.
So I want to add one which I experienced. For me, I don't know whether it's getting older or whether it's the role of meditation and prayer in my life, but I feel more grateful. I don't know if I actually am, and whether I really am less annoyed, but I feel less annoyed. Maybe it's impending death. It could be that. I like to think it's the meditation and prayer. But in the case of meditation, I went on a silent meditation retreat, and we had an exercise. This was 45 minutes, and I encourage listeners to do this. 45 is hard, so maybe just at this point in the episode, if you're not driving, you could just pause this, close your eyes, and think about this. And what they encouraged us to do was to go back to our earliest memories and think of times people were kind to us.
Mm.
And I thought, well, this is silly. First of all, I thought, okay, my parents. Okay, yeah. How long am I getting? I'm not going to be able 45 minutes. But I tried. The advice was go slow. So I tried to go slowly, and I accumulated a remarkable set of kindnesses that people had done to me that I hadn't literally forgotten. I just didn't remember them on a day-to-day basis. And it was very moving.
Do you remember an example?
I'll tell you a couple, and then I'll tell you the post the after effects, which were really amazing. So one of them was when my sister was born. I'm 3.5 years older than my sister. When I was 3.5 years old, my mom and dad went to the hospital, and I had no one to stay with. We were living way far away from any relatives, and my parents had a friend, and he took care of me during that time. And after that, it was because he was a family friend, he was extremely generous to me. He gave me my first guitar, and because of that, I became a guitar. I could play the guitar. I'm not call myself a guitarist. That would be a lie. But I do play the guitar from time to time. But he gave me a different perspective on music. That's just one of the many, many things he had done for me. Well, he doesn't live near us anymore. He's 80-something years old, and he's not on the internet. I hadn't emailed him, and I asked my dad to find his number, and I called him, and I thanked him. And he cried. I cried too. It was deeply moving that he had been remembered and appreciated. I tracked down my 8th grade teacher, Miss Canine, who I've mentioned on this program before. And it was really hard to do, but I finally found someone who knew her, knew someone who knew someone, and finally got her a letter and wrote her a letter that how she had changed my life. And she wrote back a beautiful letter that was, incredibly moving. So if you do that exercise, it should engender deep feelings of gratitude and then you should act on it. It's incredibly powerful, empowering and powerful.
I love that. And I had the same experience. I remember a couple of years ago calling out of the blue my first editor at a tiny, tiny newspaper in suburban California. And it was a little awkward because, I hadn't spoken to him in 15, 20 years. But again, it did turn out to be moving, I think, for both of us. And there was just a study. I'm skeptical of single studies in general in social science, but
not me, AJ. I'm sure this is the absolute truth. Go ahead.
Okay, this one. Well, since I like the study, I'm going to believe.
There you go.
But they said that we overestimate the awkwardness of these of thanking people, and we underestimate the meaningfulness to them. And I think that is true from my personal experience.
No, I agree with that. I think that is true of my personal experience. It's a beautiful thing. Has writing the book and going through this exercise, do you think it's made you a more grateful person because now you're done. Now you can write a book on ingratitude.
I can just take everything for granted.
Yeah, the book's done. So has it changed, do you think?
I do think it had a pretty big impact. And as I say, I still get annoyed all the time, but I've become a much more grateful person. Partly because I think from a selfish point of view, it's just a much better way to live. From an outside point of view, being annoyed is funny. It's funny to watch on TV. It's funny to listen to other people complain sometimes. But when you're seeing the world that way, it's not always that pleasant. And being able to appreciate the hundreds of amazing things that are in our lives is really a much better way to live. And there's a phrase, I didn't make it up, but, happiness does not lead to gratitude. Gratitude leads to happiness. And I find that to be quite true in my case.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's, I think the challenge is that, and this fascinates me, I don't know if it's the evolutionary psychology point, but I kind of find myself at times reveling in getting annoyed, reveling in getting and Twitter does this to me sometimes, right? Social media, I think, does this to us occasionally. Sometimes it feels good to work yourself up into a state. And when you try the other, just saying, I'm not going to get mad, but it does take, I think it takes some form of meditation or mindfulness, prayer, writing a book. All those things are actually, they're not unrelated, to help you keep it in mind, because it's so easy for your mind to grab you and take you in a different place. Absolutely. And yeah, you're right. It does feel good. It's like junk food. It just feels, it gives you a momentary boost. But I think in the long term is quite harmful to us. And I talked to one of my friends who's a philosopher at Oxford, and I asked him, what are you grateful for? And he had a very interesting answer. He said, sometimes I'm just grateful that I have arms. And because it's easy to be grateful, if you get a big promotion, that's easy to focus on. But remembering the things that we take totally for granted, like arms, which do come in handy. It would have been much harder to write this book without arms. So I love that mindset of really focusing on what we take for granted. And another thing that I think you would agree, because I love the way you talk about the past, is, we should be grateful that we live right now. We've got a lot of problems. It's a very challenging time, but the good old days were not good. The good old days were terrible. They were disease-ridden, and they were poverty-filled, and it was just not a place you wanted to be. Yeah, just if you ever have a root canal, you do appreciate, but of course, if you want to be a half-empty glass kind of guy, you can certainly say, I resent that I'm not living 100 years from now when we'll live to be 200 with no infirmities. And
right.
But I don't know. But I do think we romanticize the past. And I actually take it, I think, often to a more basic level, which is I'm just happy to be alive at 64 years old and to be blessed with all the lucky things that I have. And anytime I think of those is a good thing. I think the more you think about those things, the better.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what you said, when I try to, when I get annoyed, I do, my 3-word mantra is surgery without anesthesia. I mean, just think about that. And it will wake you up.
That's good. I like that. I have a whole bunch of them. But I do think what's interesting about this is how hard it is to rationally decide I'm going to be more appreciative of what I have. That's hard. And I think you need some kind of regimen, whether it's mindfulness or reading H.A. Jacobs' book, Thanks 1,000, which I'm serious, by the way. It's a short book, by the way, so spending an hour-ish or a little more than an hour or maybe 2 with H.A. Jacobs about the virtues of gratitude is probably one way of engendering a little more gratitude, a little less annoyance, a little more Mr. Rogers.
Well, I am, of course, very grateful for you for saying that. But I agree. You definitely need to concentrate. It doesn't come naturally. I wish it did, but you really do need to make it a practice. And there are studies. Again, I'm skeptical of any single study, but there are lots of studies about keeping a gratitude journal and writing down 3 things you're grateful for every day. And I do trade. I actually trade emails with my mom every day, and on what I'm grateful for and what she's grateful for.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I find it she likes it, I like it, and it assuages my guilt for not being in touch with her more. So it all works.
So I'm going to read a poem. I apologize, indulge me, because it kind of captures this mom gratitude thing, which I love. It's by Billy Collins. It's called The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift from my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard, or wear one, if that's what you did with them, but that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim, and I in turn presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education. And here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here, I wish to say to her now, is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-toned lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even.
Oh, I love that. What a fantastic poem.
Such a good poem. Thank you for the excuse of letting me read it on EconTalk.
And it reminds me, I think I mentioned this in the book, my feeling on birthdays.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I think that we've got it all wrong because we congratulate the person who was born, but that person, they didn't do the hard part. They just got out and they screamed for milk and maybe took an APGAR test. But the one who did all the work was the mom who was pushing and,
suffering.
Yeah, suffering like I can't even imagine. So, yeah, I think we should combine birthday wishes for both the person born and the birther. So, I mean, Labor Day was already taken as a word, so we can't say Happy Labor Day, but the same idea, I think.
Well, I like that one, though. I'm going to take Labor Day and use it to thank my wife and my mom. I love that. That's even better. Let's go back to coffee for a minute. Just for fun, how did this project change your morning experience of drinking a cup of coffee?
Well, one thing is, I'm still no, sommelier of coffee, but it did force me to at least think about the taste of coffee for 2 seconds. All these people put in thousands of hours to make my coffee. The least I could do is focus for 2 seconds on the taste. And it's, you don't have to spend a long time, but just think about the acidity and the sweetness and the texture. And I do that with a lot of different food now. And I think it does help. And psychologists talk about savoring as a very important part of life and just stretching out a moment for a little longer than normal, because if you don't, then everything just goes by in a flash and that's it. So trying to focus on a moment. And I actually, I try to do this a lot in life, is pick out a moment of the day and try to remember it. I have a list on my computer called One Thing, and it's a document. One thing I remember from a meal, one thing I remember from a conversation, a book, a podcast. And I find it very helpful because otherwise it all just blurs together.
So explain that in a little more detail. You say you have a document called One Thing?
Yeah. And it's
just a list of any...
It's just a list of what I found most interesting or most memorable. Here, I'll try to open it up. But, after listening, I've done on your podcast, actually. Well, this is a good way to do it. I've listed things from your podcast that have really stuck with me. One of them was similar to what we've been talking about. It was when you asked Bill James, the sabermetrics baseball guy, what he had learned, and he talked about how many people it takes to make a championship baseball team.
Yeah.
And, the minor league coach, the parents who nurtured the kid, the whoever did the carpool to bring the kids to practice. And I loved that. So that went in the One Thing file.
That's beautiful. But then you just listed, the next thing might be one thing you remember from dinner last night that was special.
Right, like something my kids did, or it could be, in a conversation or a party I went to, the one thing someone said. And I love it. I go back to it every few days and just, because again, otherwise, I don't know about everyone, but my brain just turns it all into mush and you don't remember the high points.
That's really a beautiful idea. And I think about, there are people who are religious note takers in class, and sometimes you wonder if they get anything out of it because they write everything down. So it's not the one thing, and maybe it could be two things sometimes. I assume sometimes you put more than one thing from the same.
I have veered from the one thing path. Yeah.
Because what's interesting to me is I'd forgotten that Bill James insight, which I loved when I heard it. So thank you. But I also, the one I remembered from that was when I asked him if we'd plumb the depths fully of our knowledge of baseball. And he says something like, we know nothing. And here's the person who has, I think, done more than any one person to help us understand the analytical aspect of this weird game. And I was on October 22nd today, I say go Red Sox. Tomorrow night's their game one of the World Series. But here's a person who's done more than anything, and yet he feels he knows nothing. And that's the one that stuck with me, even though I didn't write it down. But I wish I had written it down because he said it better than that. And I can go back to the transcript and get it. But I love that. Do you do it at a particular time each day, or do you have a routine?
I do it before I go to bed, yeah. So I go through the day, what podcast I listened to and what was the one thing that stood out. And I'll try while listening to a podcast, I'll be like, okay, that's going to be the one thing. And it's funny because I wish I loved the point that Bill James made about epistemological humility, because that I'm obsessed with that too. So I'm going to add that, even though it was two things. And I have another one from your podcast. You talked about, I've never seen this cartoon, but you talked in one episode about a cartoon or a comic where it was just a broom sweeping and a steering wheel for the bus without any people, to show how much in life we take for granted and don't acknowledge the people, which is also very much in the theme of my book.
Yeah, I try to think, like, when I get off the shuttle from the airport to the parking lot, I always thank the driver. And I try to thank the driver face to face rather than just calling out thank you. But sometimes I call it thank you because I'm in the wrong place. But I wonder how much that it's better than not doing it, for sure. But I often wonder how much it matters. But it matters for me, by the way, because I think encouraging that sense of gratitude makes you a better person, even if the other person didn't hear it. So I'm going to disagree with your son a little bit, but I think it's better to tell him face to face, for sure. But I think having that emotion is a helpful thing.
I agree. I think it helps the thanker and the thankee. And I do think, at least from my limited, interviews with people, that it does matter. When I interviewed the barista, she said the worst part of her job, well, first of all, it's a tough job because you're encountering people in a very dangerous state, which is pre-caffeination. So they're not in their best. But she says the worst part is that so many people treat her like a vending machine. They don't even acknowledge that she's a human. They just are looking at their phones. They hand her the credit card without looking up. They take it back and don't say anything. So even just the 2 seconds of making eye contact, acknowledging she's a human, makes a huge difference for her. And, I'm not expecting a Nobel Prize, but I have started to make eye contact because I realized I'm that putz. I'm the one who just, doesn't look up when dealing with people. And, maybe in a few decades, there won't be people to deal with, just robots. But for now, we should treat them like humans that they are.
Yeah, I totally agree. Definitely. It's just an easy way to make the world a better place without having to really suffer very much. You can look up from your phone, really. You can. It's not that big a deal.
It is, exactly. Low impact, low output, but high impact.
Now, is the book out?
It is out November 13th.
Okay.
But it is available for pre-order in case anyone's interested.
Yeah, I'm not sure where this will air, but I think it'll be close to November 13th. I'm interested in how this book will affect your coffee shop, because I have to confess that, you talk about the logo of the coffee shop, how that was designed, and that's part of the experience. And I looked up, I wanted to see it. So I Googled Joe's Coffee, which is interesting, Joe Coffee, and I found it, which is surprising because Joe is a slang word for coffee, and I thought I'd have trouble finding it, but it came up right away because Google's so smart. They know I was reading your book probably, but creepy, but smart. No, I did find it, and it dawned on, it's a beautiful logo, like he's described it. I wonder how it gave me an urge to go to that coffee shop, which is just interesting, and I wonder if that'll happen.
Well, I think they do a good job, and they're very thoughtful. They deal with small farms, and so listen, I would be delighted if it helped. And it is interesting, the crossover between business and gratitude, because I'm writing a piece for LinkedIn about how gratitude can help your business in many ways. There are all these CEOs like Mary Kay, the founder of Mary Kay Cosmetics, would write 10 handwritten thank you notes a day, and she credited it with helping her business. And being thoughtful and thankful for your customers, that I think is it allows you to, it motivates you to try to do well by them. You're not just trying to make money; you're trying to help your customers, and then they'll come and you'll make more money. But anyway, that was a sort of a tangent, but semi-related. I do hope that it helps Joe Coffee because I like them.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And by the way, it's interesting. I have at least 4 things so far from this conversation. And I think I like that one thing. I'm going to write some of them down. One of them I'm going to mention is that I've always liked this bumper sticker, wag more, bark less. And it's a beautiful, simple statement. But I'm thinking about yours now, which is maybe even better. More Mr. Rogers, less Larry David. It's the same idea. And I'm a big Larry David fan. I think he's a very funny man. But
it's a delight. I wouldn't want to be inside his mind,
no.
but I love watching him.
Or at least
I like
character.
that wag more. I thought you were going to say, because I mentioned a bumper sticker in the trucking. I have a chapter on transportation, and the guy said there's a bumper sticker that's America moves on trucking, or something a little better. But the idea is that we definitely don't acknowledge how almost everything in our lives was on trucks and on these pallets, these just plain old wooden platforms. This laptop I'm looking at, this microphone, this the water canister, they were all at one point on pallets, and I've given zero thought to pallets. So I just want to shout out to pallets. I learned from the history of pallets, they helped us win World War II because we were more efficient in packing our supplies to the Pacific Theater. So shout out to pallets.
Yeah, pallets are cool, and containers are cool. Boxes are cool. They're all amazing. They make
right. There was a great book. I read a book on containers, the birth of containers. It's amazing.
Yeah. So now I have to give you a little bit of a hard time, AJ, because
I'm ready.
You picked on one of my favorite things in the world.
iPencil?
Yeah, iPencil.
I want to hear you. I don't want to say I picked on it, because I think it's a wonderful piece. I just have a couple of disagreements with it, but I want to wag the tail for iPencil as well as my couple barks.
Yeah, so iPencil is the poor man's version of your book in some dimension, obviously, and what you point out in your book. So I'm going to let you make your point first, if I may use a bad phrase, make your point about a pencil, but I'll let you sharpen your point. You very appropriately, in my view, perhaps surprising to you, but you very appropriately, in my view, thank the people who provide government services that make coffee better. So talk about that, and then how they're left out of iPencil.
Right. Well, I have a section on safety, the fact that I can drink my cup of coffee and not die, which is not something that I should take for granted, because a couple hundred years ago, the ingredients in coffee, where there was lead, there was arsenic, there was baked horse liver, there was anything you can think of. And so I was thankful for the birth of the FDA and other government agencies that try to keep us safe. And I, that was my critique of iPencil, which, as I say, is wonderful in many ways. It's more of a matter of degree. I feel that that we need to acknowledge that there should be some regulation to keep us safe, and places like the FDA, and that and maybe you and I diverge a little on this of how much regulation there should be in capitalism. So that was sort of my only critique of iPencil, is that they kind of left out the people the governments who funded the roads, the police force who kept the pencil factories safe, the government made lead illegal, which I think was a great thing. Not illegal, but so now pencils are made with graphite instead of lead. So that's where I diverged from the lovely iPencil essay.
We'll talk about water.
Talk about why?
Talk about water and the water supply that comes into the coffee in New York.
Right. Well, I realized that coffee is 98.8% water. It's just a little bit of this ground up beans. So, and I totally took for granted how much goes into the to the production of water, and that I get it for free. And maybe that's not the best system, but it is still astounding. And so I went up 200 miles north of New York, where we have the Catskills Reservoir System, which is huge. It's almost twice as big as Rhode Island, and it's just a mind-boggling amount of water. And all these people who keep it safe, who sterilize it, who build the pipes, there are hundreds of scientists, they're testing it millions of times a year. And literally millions. And, there are people whose jobs are not fun. There's there's a ranger who goes around picking up what is euphemistically called organic matter, which is like deer poop and cow poop near the reservoir, so it doesn't run into the reservoir. And it just made me realize that I give zero thought to these people when I turn on the tap. So yeah, that was, I guess that's where the chapter was on that government does provide services that can be important and good for you, and that I take for granted.
And of course, I totally agree with that. I'm not an anarchist, and I think the FDA, it's a mixed track record. It's saved us from some things, and it's probably prevented us from having some things that would have been good for us because it's overly cautious in my view. But that's a legitimate discussion. I think some of those services could be provided by third parties more effectively, not just cheaper. I don't care so much about cheaper's nice, but I really care about more effectively. But certainly the infrastructure, I think it's interesting. I often get this, I consider it a straw man argument that somehow I don't appreciate as a free market person the role of government. And of course, government's crucial for making many aspects of your cup of coffee or the pencil effective and powerful, including the roads, including some safety regulations, some of which might not be necessary, but many of them are productive and effective. So I don't have any problem with that. I don't think Milton Friedman did either, and Leonard Read did, who wrote iPencil, and we'll, of course, put a link up to iPencil. It's on our site on the Library of Economics and Liberty. But I think the other point that I think is sort of, I would say it's orthogonal to your book, and is not part of this debate over how much regulation, and the reasonable people I think can disagree over. But I think the other point that's in iPencil is this idea that you can't thank anybody for the system that provides your cup of coffee. So, for example, the example I like to use is, and my wife likes coffee a lot more than I do, and she's a lot more discriminating. And you're probably somewhere between. Sounds like you're between you and.
Right.
I hate to say you've come between you and my wife, but appears to be the case.
I want to do that.
So my wife is very serious about her coffee. So when we're staying somewhere on vacation or a trip, she wants to have a good cup of coffee. And of course, she can bring her own equipment if she needs to, if she has to, but generally she doesn't. For her, Starbucks is a minimum standard, right? It's not what she prefers, but she will drink Starbucks at least, thank goodness. Probably won't drink Dunkin' Donuts, just, for the record. But when you're in a major American city, even a minor American city now, you can walk out of your hotel room and you will find a pretty good cup of coffee, sometimes a great cup of coffee, within a 10-minute walk. And usually it's a 2-minute walk. And that's, who do you thank for that? And there's no one person, there's no, the whole system of competition, which keeps Joe in line, your coffee shop. If Joe were the only coffee shop in New York, I don't think they'd be very good at it. That's what I think the contribution of iPencil is to make you recognize that and it's in Hayek as well, of course, that this incredible network of cooperation between the truck driver and the coffee bean roaster and the maker of the equipment for all those things, that network is held together by a set of prices and the freedom to shop where you want, that keeps things in line that no agency has to do, no one deliberately has to do. And that's just that's what makes me romanticize capitalism. I recognize there are things that go wrong. I recognize it needs government to work well. But that whole phenomenon to me is something else to be grateful for without having anyone to thank, because no one's in charge of it. I
love that. Yeah. And, well, first of all, I think when the coffee professionals I talk to agree with your wife about Starbucks that they think it's too bitter. But I love what you said about that. And yeah, maybe I didn't give enough weight in my book to that part of iPencil, because I am, of course, as I say, I think capitalism is the best system humans have come up with. And it is astounding how all these things work together. And I do agree with Steven Pinker, who says, capitalism has lifted billions of people out of poverty, even in the last 50 years. So I certainly wouldn't want to replace it. And that is one thing I also loved about iPencil, is he, again, endorses humility. And because the sort of the arrogance of saying, I know how to plan an economy. I know what people are going to want, and I can do it all centrally. That kind of arrogance has just led to disaster. So I'm a fan of intellectual humility and I guess systemic humility.
Of course, your book is in many ways a tribute to the power of specialization, because you have all these crazy jobs that you encountered where people were doing one thing, and that's the nature of what the modern world is about to some extent, right? It's this inability to do everything for yourself, this recognition that it's good to, quote, rely on others, but in a different way than we normally think of it, through this decentralized system. And since we specialize, I'm the economist, you're the writer and the dreamer and the creative guy. So I can add this little piece without you can accept it without shame. I think that you didn't get every bit of economics into your book that I would have if I'd written it.
Agree.
Because I would have missed a lot of things that you added, right? So, did anything? Is there an aftermath to this story for your family? You have youngest children. Obviously, parents often try to inculcate gratitude into their kids. And you started this conversation with a story from a dinner table conversation. I didn't notice it in the book. Maybe I missed it. Where your kid said you need to thank these people face to face. Has anything that you experienced and then shared with your family changed the way you treat them, parent them, your kids, or their experience?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I do think it's good for patience, which is something, my kids are 12, and 14, and you need a huge amount of patience and try to, there's a saying that you should try to, for every criticism you have of your wife and kids or spouse, partner, you should try to have 5 good things to say, which is an incredibly high standard. I don't know if there's any science behind it, but I do like the message there. And yeah, I think it has sunk into my kids a little. I think in general, and I was this way until just a few years ago, we're very self-centered. So trying to get them out of their own little minds and realize how connected. And I think it's sinking in. Not totally, but I think it's sinking in. I'm very proud of them. And, one of my sons, when we were at my mom's house, he said, "Thank you, Grandma, for, buying this sugar cereal. And thank your parents for having you, and thank their parents for having them." And I love that he was sort of thinking about the chain. So yes, it definitely has had an impact. I mean, I'm always wary to say, I have friends who write books on happiness or how to have the perfect family. And I'm like, how do you do that? Because the pressure, like if your family, if your kids turn out terribly, like there goes your career. So I'm not going to boast that I'm a perfect parent, but it has made me a better one. Did
you tell your children about your adventures, say, when you went to the coffee bean growers in Colombia? It was Colombia, right?
Yeah. I went down
Did you
there.
tell them those stories, and did you keep them up to date, or do you just hope that they'll read your book?
Oh, no. They are, I think they're not going to read it because I told them everything. So no, I did all the spoilers. But they, I made sure every adventure I came home, with the water. When I went to visit the people who, my son has a tortoise and he squirts the tortoise with water from our sink. And I say, there were hundreds of people who made that water possible. So, you and Sheldon, the tortoise, should be very grateful. And, they might roll their eyes, but again, I do think it sinks in a little. And I'm interested for Thanksgiving because I want to, instead of going around and just, if you don't give specific instructions at Thanksgiving, it's just like, I'm thankful for my family, or I'm thankful for my Nintendo game system. But I'm going to ask them to try to be as creative as possible in who they thank at Thanksgiving. It could be the person who invented the nitrogen fixation process so that they could grow the cranberries, so we could have cranberries on the table. They might not go with nitrogen fixation, but maybe I will. But I want them to be creative in thinking of who to thank, because that way it's not just automatic, not just rote.
My guest today has been A.J. Jacobs. His book is Thanks 1,000. A.J., thank you for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you. More than 1,000, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.